Have you ever wondered why some countries bounce back from disasters in months, while others struggle for decades? Why South Korea recovered from total devastation to become a tech powerhouse, while other countries with similar destruction stayed poor for generations? Why some economies crash and come back stronger, while others crash and never recover? Here's what nobody talks about. It's not about resources. It's not about luck. It's not even about how bad the crisis was. The countries that recover fast do specific things that struggling countries don't. And once you see the pattern, you'll understand why some nations thrive after disasters while others collapse. Here at Simple Money, we've studied dozens of economic recoveries, from wars to financial crashes to pandemics. And what we've found will change how you think about resilience, not just for countries, but for your own finances too. Today, I'm going to show you exactly why some countries recover faster after crises, and how understanding this can help you build unshakable financial resilience in your own life. Here's what's really happening. When a crisis hits, everyone focuses on how bad it is, how much wealth was destroyed, how many people are suffering, how long it will take to rebuild. But that's not what determines recovery speed. Not even close. Think about it like this. Imagine two people both lose their jobs on the same day. Same industry, same salary, same savings, same bills. One person is back on their feet in 3 months. Better job, more money, more stable than before. The other person is still struggling 2 years later. Behind on bills, credit card debt, can't find decent work. What's the difference? It's not the crisis. The crisis was identical. It's what they did after the crisis hit. Countries work the same way. The crisis itself matters less than the response to the crisis. And here's the crucial part. The countries that recover fast do things that feel wrong in the moment. Things that seem risky. Things that struggling countries are too scared to try. Let me show you what I mean. The first thing fast-recovering countries do is what I call the decisive break. When crisis hits, most countries try to preserve the old system. They bail out failing companies. They protect old industries. They try to go back to how things were before. It feels safe. It feels conservative. It feels like the responsible thing to do. But it's the worst possible choice, because the old system is what led to the crisis in the first place. Fast-recovering countries do the opposite. They let the old system break, completely. They let failing companies fail. They let obsolete industries die. They embrace the destruction. And then they build something new, something better, something that works. Think about South Korea after the Korean War. The entire country was destroyed. Everything. Infrastructure gone, industry gone, economy gone. Most countries would have tried to rebuild what was there before. The same farms, the same small industries, the same traditional economy. South Korea said no. We're not rebuilding the past. We're building something completely new. They focused on education, on technology, on manufacturing, on exports. Things Korea had never done before. Things that seemed risky and uncertain. Within 30 years, South Korea went from one of the poorest countries on earth to one of the richest. Not despite the destruction. Because of how they responded to it, compare that to countries that tried to preserve their old systems. They're still struggling. Still poor, still stuck. The decisive break feels dangerous, but holding on to a broken system is more dangerous. The second pattern is what I call the investment paradox. Here's what struggling countries do after a crisis. They cut spending, reduce investment, try to save money, balance the budget. It sounds responsible. It sounds like good financial management. Everyone talks about tightening belts and being prudent, but it's backwards. Because the time to cut spending is during good times, not during crises. Fast-recovering countries do the opposite. They increase investment during crises, massively, even though it seems crazy. They build infrastructure when they can barely afford it. They fund education when money is tight. They invest in new industries when the old ones are collapsing. Why? Because crises are when you can build things cheaply. Labor is available. Materials are cheap. Everyone's desperate for work. And because the investments you make during a crisis determine what your economy looks like when recovery comes. Look at the United States after the Great Depression. The economy was destroyed. Unemployment was 25%. Banks were failing. Businesses were closing. The government didn't cut spending. They increased it, dramatically. They built highways, bridges, dams, schools. They hired millions of people. They invested in the future when it seemed least affordable. Those investments paid off for decades. The infrastructure built during the Depression supported economic growth for 50 years. Meanwhile, countries that cut investment during crises, they recovered slower, much slower, because they had nothing to build on when growth returned. The investment paradox says spend when it hurts, save when it's easy. Most countries do the opposite. That's why they stay stuck. The third thing is what I call the flexibility advantage. Struggling countries respond to crisis by adding rules. More regulations, more controls, more protection. They try to prevent bad things from happening by restricting what people can do. It feels like safety. It feels like taking charge. It feels like protecting people from harm. But it has the opposite effect. Because rigid systems break under pressure. Flexible systems bend and adapt. Fast-recovering countries reduce restrictions during crises. They make it easier to start businesses, easier to hire people, easier to try new things, easier to fail and try again. They remove barriers instead of adding them. They increase freedom instead of restricting it. Think about Estonia after the Soviet Union collapsed. Their entire economic system disappeared overnight. Everything they knew stopped working. They could have created strict controls, heavy regulation, central planning to manage the chaos. Instead, they did the opposite. They created one of the freest, most flexible economies in the world. Easy business registration, low taxes, minimal bureaucracy, digital everything. Within 20 years, Estonia went from Soviet Republic to one of the most advanced digital economies on Earth, all because they chose flexibility over control. Compare that to countries that responded to collapse with more control, more rules, more restrictions. They're still struggling to grow, still trapped in bureaucracy. Flexibility feels risky, control feels safe. But in a crisis, flexibility saves you, control kills you. The fourth pattern is the accountability reset. This one's uncomfortable. Because it means admitting that people in power messed up, that the old system failed, that changes are necessary. Struggling countries avoid accountability. They blame external factors, bad luck, foreign interference, unfair treatment, anything except their own choices. And because they don't admit mistakes, they don't learn from them. They keep making the same errors. They stay stuck in the same patterns. Fast-recovering countries do the opposite. They hold people accountable, publicly, harshly, even when it's painful. They fire incompetent leaders. They prosecute corruption. They admit what went wrong. They acknowledge failures. And then they change the system so those failures don't happen again. New rules, new leaders, new approaches. Look at Iceland after their banking crisis in 2008. Their entire banking system collapsed. The economy crashed. Everything seemed hopeless. They didn't protect the bankers. They prosecuted them. They held leaders accountable. They admitted the system was broken. They rewrote their financial rules, changed how banks operated, created transparency, implemented real consequences for failure. Within 5 years, Iceland's economy was growing again, stronger than before, because they fixed what was broken instead of pretending it was fine. Compare that to countries that bailed out bad actors, protected corrupt leaders, avoided accountability. They're still dealing with the same problems, still vulnerable to the same crises. Accountability feels harsh, protection feels kind, but avoiding accountability means repeating mistakes forever. Now here's where things get really interesting, because there's a deeper pattern underneath all of these differences. Fast-recovering countries share one fundamental mindset. They see crisis as opportunity, not just as disaster. This sounds like toxic positivity, like pretending bad things are good, like denying the pain and suffering that crises cause. But that's not what it means. They acknowledge the disaster. They help the victims. They address the immediate suffering. But they also ask a crucial question. What can we build now that we couldn't build before? Because crises destroy old systems, old power structures, old ways of doing things, and that destruction creates space for something new. Before crisis, vested interests protect the status quo. Powerful people block changes. Old systems resist reform. Progress is slow or impossible. After crisis, those barriers are gone. Old powers are weakened, old systems are discredited, change becomes possible. Fast-recovering countries seize that moment. They make changes that would be impossible in normal times. They build systems that would face too much resistance otherwise. Struggling countries waste that moment. They try to rebuild what was there before. They restore old powers. They recreate old systems. They miss the opportunity. Let me tell you about two very different countries facing similar crises. Country A had a major financial crisis. Banks collapsed, businesses failed, unemployment soared, the economy crashed. The government's response was to bail out the banks, protect the financial sector, preserve the existing system. They borrowed massive amounts of money to keep everything running as it was. They added regulations, but kept the same leaders, the same structure, the same incentives that caused the crisis. They told citizens to be patient, to accept lower wages, to work harder, to make sacrifices while the system recovered. 10 years later, the economy was still struggling. Growth was weak. Unemployment was high. Young people were leaving. Debt was enormous, because they rebuilt the same system that failed. The same problems that caused the crisis were still there, just hidden better. Now let me tell you about Country B. Same situation. Financial crisis, bank collapse, economic crash. But their response was completely different. They let the bad banks fail. All of them. They protected depositors, but not the institutions. They prosecuted fraud. They held leaders accountable. They fired people responsible for the disaster. They cut taxes on new businesses, made it easier to start companies, invested in education and infrastructure, created incentives for innovation. They told citizens the truth. This will hurt short term, but we're building something better, something that won't fail this way again. 5 years later, their economy was booming. New industries, new jobs, lower unemployment than before the crisis, government debt falling, because they built a new system. One that worked better. One that was more resilient. One that created opportunity instead of protecting failure. Here's what most people don't realize. The difference between Country A and Country B wasn't resources, wasn't geography, wasn't natural advantages. It was choice. Specifically, the choice between preserving the past or building the future. Country A chose the past. It felt safer, less disruptive, more stable, but it trapped them in decline. Country B chose the future. It felt risky, chaotic, uncertain, but it set them up for growth. And here's the thing. This pattern applies to you, to your personal finances, to how you recover from your own crises. When you lose your job, do you try to find the same type of work, or do you see it as a chance to switch careers? When your industry declines, do you fight to preserve it, or do you develop new skills? When you face a financial setback, do you try to restore what was, or do you build something better? The countries that recover fast see crisis as a forcing function, something that pushes them to make changes they should have made earlier. They don't waste the crisis. They use it. Most people do the opposite. They see crisis as something to survive, to endure, to get through so they can return to normal. But normal is what led to the crisis. Going back to normal means setting yourself up for the next crisis. The question isn't whether crises will happen. They will, always, for countries and for individuals. The question is whether you'll use them or waste them, whether you'll see them as pure destruction or as painful opportunities. Fast-recovering countries make 4 key choices when crisis hits. They break decisively with failed systems instead of trying to preserve them, even when it's scary, even when it feels risky. They increase investment when others cut spending. They build for the future when it seems least affordable. They increase flexibility when others add restrictions. They make it easier to adapt, experiment, and change direction. They hold people accountable when others protect the guilty. They admit failures and fix what's broken. These choices feel wrong in the moment. They feel dangerous, irresponsible, risky. But they're what separates recovery from stagnation, growth from decline, resilience from fragility. And here's what you need to understand. These same principles apply to personal finance, to your career, to your financial security. When you face a financial crisis, you have the same choice. Preserve what failed or build something better. Try to go back to normal or create a new normal. Protect old habits or develop new ones. The people who recover fastest from financial setbacks aren't lucky. They're not smarter. They're not more talented. They just understand something crucial. Crisis destroys your old financial life. You can rebuild the same thing, or you can build something better. Most people try to rebuild the same thing because it's familiar, because change is hard, because new things are uncertain. But fast recoverers see opportunity in destruction. They ask what they can build now that they couldn't before. Maybe they couldn't change careers before because they needed the steady income. Now they can retrain. Maybe they couldn't start a business before because they were too comfortable. Now they can take the risk. Maybe they couldn't move to a better city before because they were settled. Now they can relocate. The crisis forced change. They can resist it and struggle, or embrace it and grow. This is what separates people who bounce back stronger from people who never fully recover. Not resources, not luck, not even the severity of the crisis. It's how they respond to it, what they choose to build, whether they see destruction or opportunity. Countries that recover fast understand this deeply. They don't waste their crises. They use them to make changes that were impossible before. You can do the same in your career, your finances, your life. The question isn't whether you'll face crises. You will. Economic downturns, job losses, unexpected expenses, industry disruptions. The question is what you'll build afterward. The same thing that failed? Or something better? Fast recoverers know the answer. They build better. Every time. That's why they bounce back stronger. That's why some countries recover in years, while others struggle for decades. That's why some people emerge from financial crisis better than before, while others stay stuck. It's not about the crisis. It's about the response. And the response is always a choice. What will you choose?